Okay, so we are today with Malgorzata Kulbaczewska Figat from the Polish seat Strike EU, and we will talk about the um, February Revolution in Russia because in we have anniversary, so 103 anniversary of the revolution, and
Four, four already. We are
four, yes, four, 104, because all the time I am in 2020, and I need 3 months to start thinking about that it is 2021. So let's begin. I am.
so we are actually approaching another anniversary of one of the most remarkable events in the world. One of the event that began something even more astonishing, that is the revolutionary process in Russia, which, as John Reed once put it, shake the world and definitely change the balance of forces in both international relations and the international workers' movement. But what is the most astonishing, perhaps, about the February Revolution was that it came totally unexpected to most of the revolutionary figures of the time. Although Russian socialist movement, Russian revolutionary movement had been active for decades before 1917, to most of its leaders and activists, it came as an absolute surprise that at the end of February or beginning of March of 1917, the difference is due to the difference in calendars used in Tsarist Russia and in Western Europe. So, to most of the activists of the socialist parties, what happened at the end of February or beginning of March, depending on how do you count time, was an absolute astonishment. Let's just remind that just 3 years earlier, when Russia entered the World War, most of citizens of Russia, inhabitants of Russia, including Russian workers, were taken away by the force of patriotic emotions. They were happy about Russia participating in a big international events, and even the strike movement that had been very strong in Russia the years before seemed to give way to this patriotic emotion. And yet in 1917, a revolution takes place and the Tsarist autocracy is virtually kicked off by the revolting workers of Petrograd and other Russian industrial centers. But let us start from the very beginning. So, what were the reasons for the revolution that nobody expected? As Alexander Rabinovich, one of the most authoritarian historians of 1917 events and the Russia and then the reign of Bolsheviks, the first years of the reign of the Bolsheviks, there were many long-term and short-term reasons for revolution in the beginning of 1917. On one hand, there was pre-war political and economic instability. There was technological backwardness of the Russian state. There were fundamental social divisions, and they went together with short-term causes such as mismanagement of the war effort, the series of military defeats, outrageous scandals surrounding the royal family. So let us examine for a moment all of the causes that the historian spoke about. So, pre-war political and economic instability and technological backwardness. Let us remember that capitalism in Russia was has just entered the phase of a very speed development by the end of 19th century and at the beginning of 20th century, only after the decision of Tsar Alexander II of abolishing the serfdom of the peasantry. Only this moment, only so Russia started a transformation towards being a modern capitalist country much later than other great powers in the west of Europe, and that the building of capitalist system was done in the most antisocial way that it can be imagined. Of course, capitalism is always an antisocial order of things, but what happened in Russia was the most severe exploitation of the workers, coupled with the all the possible support of the Russian state for the capitalists, both foreign and a smaller group of domestic investors. So it was in Russia, it was impossible for the workers' movement to develop just around economic slogans for a very simple reasons. Wherever workers in Russia revolted against the working condition, against low wages, against against the bad treatment of workers and working women, so immediately there was the representative of Tsarist regime stood on the side of the exploiters. There were Cossacks sent to disperse strikers. There were police sent to arrest the most active workers' activists. So the workers' movement in Russia that was growing up together with industrialization and building up of the capitalist system was from the very beginning also aimed against monarchy, against the authoritarian state that was so ruthless towards the workers. And these circumstances led already to the so-called First Russian Revolution, so the revolution of 1905, which must be mentioned at this moment so that we understand properly what happened 12 years later. So before the 1905 revolution, the Russian workers could have borne some illusions about Russian Tsar and the very structure of the Russian state. So before 1905, it was, for instance, quite popular among the Russian workers to think, like it was earlier among the Russian peasants, to think that the Tsar is in general a good person, is a good ruler, is like a father to his enormously big state, but under him he has bad generals, he had bad officials, he had bad councillors around him, but the Tsar himself should not be touched, should not be attacked. But what happened in 1905 when the workers of Petrograd, protesting against the working conditions and low salaries, wanted to hand in a petition to the Tsar himself, they were met by soldiers, they were met by firing, and there were hundreds, if not thousands, of killed workers during the peaceful march with icons, with religious flags, of the people who just wanted to ask the Tsar to treat them a little bit better than it happened in the previous decades. So the revolution of 1905. This event, known as Bloody Sunday in Petersburg, 1905, in January 1905, started a wave of strikes that went through all the big industrial centers of Russia. That was, the workers were striking in Petersburg, in Moscow, in Ivanovo, where the first workers' council, the Soviet, was formed, first workers' council in history. They were striking also in Caucasus, in Rostov, and in the mining center of the Donbass, and also in heavily industrialized western provinces of the Russian Empire. Well, what was the reaction of the Tsar against such a huge workers' movement that involved hundreds of thousands of workers? Well, the answer was bloody repressions, because most of the striking workers were pacified. There were arrests, there were massacres of protesting workers, like in Łódź, now today in central Poland, and then in the very western part of the Imperial Russia. And theoretically, Tsar gave in political way. So he issued a manifesto saying that there would be no more autocracy and that Russia would slowly strive in the direction of constitutional monarchy, of the British kind, perhaps. But all of that turned out to be just a promise for a moment to calm down the emotions. And during the following decade, the Russian parliament, or the Duma, was gradually limited in its possibilities by the Tsar. It was dissolved a few times by the Tsar, so there were four Dumas altogether. But so what I want to say is that the transformation towards constitutional monarchy, in fact, was never established, and that the autocracy was this archaic autocratic system was still in use at the very beginning of the First World War, and the conditions in which the workers lived and worked remained outrageous. But, as you know, every revolution is a lesson for the working class, and so even if the 1905 revolution was a failure ultimately for the workers' movements, even if they were massacred, even if they were arrested and exiled, the workers realized that strike is really an action that can hit at the very heart of the monarchy, of the capitalist exploitation, and that they have a powerful weapon in their hands. So even if at the beginning of the First World War this lesson was kind of forgotten. So in 1917, where the popular dissent was growing much stronger, then the workers remembered all of what they learned 12 years earlier. And again, they started striking, manifesting, and to show their very, very disagreement of what the imperial Russia was. So, yet coming back to the long-term causes, we need to also, to have a successful revolution, you need on one hand a strictly an organized workers' movement, a workers' party that is able to form a strategy and to react to events. But on the other hand, there must be there must be a crisis in the ruling circles, so that the blow delivered by the workers is not responded strongly by the ruling circles, but instead they started to weaken. They don't know what to do, and as a result, a way is paved for the workers to take power. So the Russian monarchy in 1917 was experiencing one of its most severe crises, which was connected strictly to the personalities of the Tsar, the Tsarina, and the people around them. So Nicholas II, who in 1917 entered his 21st year of rule, he became the Tsar in 1894. So yes, he was already ruling for more than 20 years in Russia. He was a weak personality. He was not a strong man, and basically all his idea about ruling his enormous country was that his task is to preserve the holy ruse to those who would come after him. And what is the holy ruse? So holy ruse is it was a great political myth of the imperial Russia, saying that Russia as an Orthodox country, as the biggest, the strongest Eastern Orthodox Christian country in the world, is a country particularly chosen by God, and to preserve the true Christian faith and the true form of government that, as you might guess, is of course the autocratic monarchy. So Nicholas II was absolutely impregnated to any ideas of reforming the monarchy, of giving concessions to people, not even to mention tackling the questions of social justice, because in his mind, well, peasants and workers were just to concede to their plight. They were to work and not to give any demands to him, the supreme ruler. And to make the matters even worse, Nicholas II had around him not intelligent politicians or people who were really, people who could have think a little bit more strategically about his country. But his main counselor was actually his wife, Alexandra Fedorovna, a woman with tendency, also a very religious or Eastern Orthodox woman with tendencies to mysticism, who could not really help her husband to understand what was going on around. And to make things yet worse, she was under influence of Grigory Rasputin, so the man who you have certainly heard about, the pseudo-Orthodox monk who, as she believed, who was able to cure their seriously ill son, Tsarevich Alexei, but who also had political ambitions and who pointed to the Tsar and Tsarina who should hold an office in the government and what should be done in the nearest future. So To sum all this up, Russia entered at the beginning of 1917. Russia had a completely incompetent ruler with all the political power in his hand, and who had as a counselor people even worse than him. And yet Russia was in war. And this is perhaps the crucial factor that we need to take into consideration if you want to understand both February and then October Revolution. Because, the incompetency of the Tsar was widely known before 1917. All the contradictions in the Russian capitalist society were also widely known before, but it was the war and the series of military catastrophes that Russia suffered that made people really angry, and also all the economical problems caused by the war also made people willing to go out in the streets and riot, not against one decision of the Tsar, but against the very institution of the monarchy itself. So let us sum up shortly what was the Russia's plight in the First World War. So Russia entered the war in August 1913, so it participated from the very beginning, with the entering into war in an alliance with Great Britain and France was accepted by all the Russian political class. And as I said, the declaration of war provoked, I don't want to say a revival of nationalism across Russian society, but definitely a rise in patriotic feelings and the sense that a huge war of the Slavs against the Germans is coming. So in the beginning, Russian troops were successful. So in 1915, they took Austrian Galicia. In 1917, they also had more successes in the southern front, but at the same time, Russian troops were defeated at Tannenberg at the very beginning of the war. It was 1914 still, and next year, 1915, Russians were forced to retreat from the Kingdom of Poland. So from the heavily industrialized western provinces, with Warsaw, with Łódź, the huge industrial center, and also from the northwestern governorates of Russia, so the most industrialized part of the country. And so in January 1917, just before the outbreak of the revolution, the morale in the Russian army was very low. The newly called up soldiers were deserting. Here we need to also point out the antagonism between officers and soldiers in the Russian army. For the soldiers originating from peasantry or the working seekers were treated in an absolutely brutal way by the officers. So this antagonism needs also to be taken into account. And plus, to all of that, we need to add the huge problems with inadequate supply that in 1917 hit both the soldiers at front and the citizens left in the backyard, left in the Russian cities. So as I said, Russia was falling at war. The huge territories of the country were occupied by the enemy. And on the home front, so in the cities, in the capital, the renamed Petrograd, on this very wave of patriotic sentiments that I talked about. So on the home front, the people started to experience a lack of most important commodities. There were lack of bread, there was lack of salt, there was lack of other very key products, key commodities. So suddenly, the Russian economy that used to grow very fast before the war was blocked from the continent's markets due to the loss of the western part of the country, was blocked from the industry that it was developed in the western part of the country. And so the people in the biggest cities started to experience the most severe shortages of food and other key products. So and yet at the same time, they saw what the Tsar was doing. So they saw that he did nothing to stop corruption in the government. They saw that the politicians really did not care about the starving people, did not care about workers and peasants, because their intention was to continue fighting the war in the alliance with the Western partners. And we need to say it, as I mentioned the Tsar already, I need to say that he, just before the February Revolution, he took yet another of his catastrophic decisions, as to take personally the command of Russian imperial troops. So obviously he was not a good military commander. He had no preparation to be a military commander, and so, being extremely unpopular already with the series of military failures, he became absolutely hated person at the beginning of 1917. So, in this atmosphere, the first street protest began to take place. And now I will try to give a concise chronology of what happened in Petrograd, because this was really an exciting story. This was a true example of the power of the workers, of the proletariat, of both male and female workers. For the role of women, it was truly outstanding, and I will point that out. And yet these events, as I already mentioned, came totally unexpected for most of socialist politicians who at that time, by the way, where the socialist politicians were. This is an important point to state for. Some of them, including Lenin, at that time were still outside of Russia, in exile after their participations in the earlier workers' movement, and some of the others had been sent to Siberia already at the beginning of the war for their consequent anti-war position that they held as possibly the only, not possibly, but certainly the only serious political force in Imperial Russia. So in Petrograd, March, if you want, 1917, the most important leaders of the socialist parties were not in the crowd. They were outside of the city, and so this revolution was absolutely an spontaneous uprising of the people. And so let's go with the concise chronology of events. So it is perhaps the most probable, the first day of the February Revolution should be considered 18 February or 3rd March, if you want, when the workers of Putylo factory announced a strike. And as it was not an economical strike, but a protest against the government, it was from the very beginning, these political and economical dimensions went together. And you need to imagine properly what was the Putylo factory in 1917. So it was not a factory with, I don't know, a few hundred of workers. It was a factory that employed over 12,000 people at the beginning of the 20th century. It produced goods for the government from the Russian railways, and also for the army. They were a major supplier of the Imperial Russian Army against the state arsenals, whose workers, by the way, went on strike soon after. So the Putylo factory was a biggest enterprise in Petersburg, truly, as like you can say, a city in a city, with workers that were absolutely furious with the working conditions, with the wages, with the way they were treated by the skilled personnel, and also more general with the conditions that the whole city was found in. So on the 18th February, they began to strike. And at the same time, we could say that, and then, first strikes were not responded in any way. Also because on the 22nd February, the Tsar left the capital and went for the front, where, as I said, he was, theoretically at least, the commander-in-chief of the Russian Imperial Army. But at the time when Putylo factory was already stopped, the food shortages became even even worse because of the Russian winter, the heavy snowstorms that came at the end of February. The cars that were carrying bread for Petrograd were like stuck on their way. So on 23rd February, the protesting workers were joined by the women who protested against the implemented food rationing, the system of rationing flour and bread, and against the food shortages that were already haunting the inhabitants of Petrograd for quite a time. So on one hand, there were protesting workers. On the other hand, there were protesting women who wanted to feed their families. And yet, there were bread riots across the whole city. For some of the people were so desperate that they just wanted to get food for their families, not to participate in a political protest. And still, and the women's protest, it need to be marked, was not only a protest against the, let's say, current economical problem. It took place on 8th March, again according to the new style, so the International Women's Day, with or more precisely, International Working Women's Day. So it was the moment when women stood not only against food shortages and against the lack of supplies and against letting workers to die in this severe Russian winter, but also stood for women's rights and the equal participation in public life. So it is very, as the eyewitnesses of the revolution put it, women were very desperate. Women were very militant at that time, and those were women who persuaded other factories to join in the strike started by the Putyov workers. It is said that even 50,000 of workers of different factories, the state arsenals, although all kinds of factories that existed in Petrograd, joined the strike. So on the following day, that we are already on 24th February, there were from 100,000 to 200,000 protesters in the street. And at this point, we heard already the screams like down with monarchy, down with the Tsar, and even more aggressive slurs against Nicholas II, his wife, and the whole autocratic system. And at this moment, we can say that no politicians, no forces had any control around what was happening in Petrograd, because theoretically the big gatherings were forbidden. Well, the country was at war, so there were some extra rules of order in the capital. So, as I said, all these demonstrations were held without any official sanctioning. But there was no force, on the other hand, that could stop workers from marching, from gathering in the Nevsky Prospect and in other key areas of Petrograd. Also, the liberal politicians were panicked. You need to understand that the liberal politicians like Mikhail Rodzianko, who presided over the Russian pseudo-parliament at that time, the Duma, these guys were also absolutely dissatisfied with Nicholas II, and they were thinking about staging a power change, so replacing Nicholas II with one of his relatives, the great princess, who would be more eager to a reforming program and to give more competences to the parliament. But as you see, those are liberal politicians. They were thinking about a plot and regime change when somewhere in the cabinets, and not about a street revolution. So, and you might ask, what did the Tsar do when he had such crowds of revolted workers insulting him, insulting the church, insulting his wife in the streets? So what did he do when his capital was against him? So actually, the first reaction of Nicholas II, who, as I said, went to the front after the strike began, was only on 25 February. So when the demonstrations were already entering their third day. And what did the Nicholas II advise? So he wanted the commander of troops in Petrograd to disperse the crowds with fire, to make the soldiers shoot at the protesters. And Furthermore, he prohibited the parliament, the Duma, of convening, of holding any more sessions. And at the time, however, the leaders of the garrison of the Petrograd garrison, the army commanders had this minimum of imaginations and did not decide to disperse the demonstrations by force. They just, on one hand, they knew that you cannot just disperse a desperate crowd of 200,000 people with a group of soldiers, and on the other hand, they also were not sure of the soldiers themselves. For, as I said, the mutinous sentiments within the army were also very strong. The army was not happy with the continuing war. The soldiers were absolutely angry with the conditions that they were supposed to live in the front. And the soldiers also understood perfectly that in many battles of this war, Russia, their blood, their fighting, their energy was lost due to bad decisions taken by the top commanders, like it happened in that 1915 when Russian army had to retreat from Kurland and from the western provinces of the imperial Russia. So, as I said, the government had workers against him. The government had and could not really count on the soldiers, and that was during the last few days. The fact that these concerns of the high commanders that the soldiers may not be trusted were absolutely justified by what happened next. For on 27th February, the Petrograd garrison began to stand against the monarchy as well. So on this day that I mentioned, 27th of February, 4 different regiments of the Russian Imperial Army stationed in Petrograd just took their rifles against the Tsar, against the autocracy, and the soldiers of Preobrazhensky and Moskovsky regiment, among others, not only joined the demonstrations but also began giving their weapons to the workers and chasing those army units that were that wanted to keep neutral position or that wondered that perhaps it was good to defend Tsar, that it was their duty. I mentioned the name of the two regiments not accidentally, as Preobrazhensky and Moskovsky regiments were among the most prestigious units of the Imperial Army, with a true legend behind them, and people planning their careers in the Imperial Army, the young noblemen wishing to become officers, really dreamed about being assigned into these regiments. So, as you see, the Russian autocracy was so rotten that its very fundaments began to fall out, began to fall down in pieces at the very pressure of the revolutionary crowd. And you might ask, how about the Cossack units that were so often used to disperse crowds during previous strike and workers' actions? Well, they pretended not to be seen in the city. They knew that they were so much hated by the workers that they, just disappeared from the way. At that time, it was still unclear what could come out of all this mess, because on one hand, people were demanding the Tsar to go. On the other hand, there was those liberal politicians that did not expect a street revolution, but began to wonder what could be made out of that. Perhaps it could help their own plots against Nicholas II. So at the same time, the socialists began to gather their forces. The socialists are correct to realize that historic events are taking place, that perhaps it would be the chance to introduce a true change to Russian state. And so by the end of February or beginning of March, the Petrograd Soviets, so the Petrograd Council of Workers and Soldiers Deputies, is formed in Petrograd. There were it was also kind of a spontaneous formation act for those socialists who were at the time present in Petrograd, gathered in one of the palaces in the center of Petrograd, the Tauride Palace, and they on the spot they chose an executive committee, and they started to publish their official newspaper. And on the following day, they began to fill the council with the representative of factory and the military. So, as I said, this council was formed mainly by those socialists who were just there in the place, and their first leader, the first chairman of the executive committee of the Soviet was Nikolai Cheidze, a representative of the Menshevik party, who at this very first phase of the revolution truly dominated the Petrograd Council, the Petrograd Soviet. But let us go back for a moment to the street, because there was, as I said, there was a mess in Petrograd, so nobody was really controlling the situation. The council was also just gathering forces to put the revolutionary movements into more organized way. But nobody wanted to everybody agreed that the Tsar must go. And so indeed on the 28th February or 13 March, even the politicians of the Duma handed Nicholas II a manifesto when they suggested introduce a constitutional system in Russia. They wanted him to sign the manifesto on the very next day, to show up in Tsarskoye Selo, that is his official residence, to come back from front and to show his conviction to the profound changes in Russia. However, when the Duma deputies visited Nikolai on his way to Petrograd, they advised him not to, show his conviction to reforms, but rather to abdicate the throne at all, as he was just too unpopular to be trusted by anybody. And so on the 2nd March already, in Pskov, in the huge railway station in the northwestern Russia, Nicholas abdicated the throne on behalf of himself and his son. He still did not accept that the monarchy in Russia was over, and he nominated his brother, the Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich, to be the next Tsar. However, Michael Alexandrovich was understood too well that the people did not want him, that the public opinion did not want a autocratic ruler anymore, and he declined the offer to take the crown. So I will just give you one more detail that would show that really at that point Nicholas II was absolutely hated by the protesting people. As I mentioned earlier, the liberal politicians wanted him to show up at Tsarskoye Selo outside Petrograd and there to show what he was gonna do next. He did not even reach the place because the soldiers who were guarding the railways, who were guarding his former imperial palace, declared their neutrality. So virtually those soldiers who were supposed to be closest to the ruling family, even them, they said that they didn't want the Tsar any longer. So it was the infamous ending of the infamous Tsarist autocracy in Russia, and everybody in the street, everybody protesting, were meeting the new realities with great hopes for democracy. There were such words on their banners they held. For social justice, they were waiting for new, more, as I said, the more just political system and the bright future opening in front of Russia. And during the next another proof of how much hatred the monarchy was the fact that during the demonstrations at the very end of February and beginning of March, the protesters destroyed the old Tsarist monuments standing in the streets of Petrograd. So, what we saw in last year during the Black Lives Matter in America, when people were tearing down the statues of colonialists, of the Confederate officers, and so on, happened also more than 100 years ago in Petrograd, where people torn down, for example, a huge equestrian statue of Alexander III, one of the former Tsars, standing in one of the key points of Petrograd, and many other places and many other Tsarist symbols as well. So, am I supposed to continue on what happened next?
Maybe I will ask you a question and you will continue to ask me a question. So for me, the most important when we learn history is what we can learn from history and what we can use to today. So my first question to you is when we saw the Russia before 1917, we saw the country which was the most reactionary countries in the world. In this time, we know all the situation in 19th century, but also we had situation after the revolution 1905. And we had one of the analyses of fascism. What is fascism? Fascism, it is brutal force of the ruling bourgeoisie. And in this perspective, we can say that the first fascist in the world, it was the Prime Minister of the Russia, Pyotr Stolypin, because he introduced the system of the killing of the revolutionaries in Russia. That we don't speak with revolutionaries. We killed them. We hanged them, and it was the first time when the after revolution, because these killings of the socialists in Russia, it was up when the revolution was finished. He continued the persecuted of the Russian socialists and killing them. My question to you is today, for example, I think that the most reactionary countries, one of the most reactionary countries in the world is the USA. What you think have to happen that this situation, which was in 1917 in Russia, that Russia was the country in 1917 or 1916 was the country the most reactionary in the world, and few months later it became one of the most democratic country in the world, because after the February Revolution we had the vote, the right for the woman, we had many things which was which was better. Yes, progressive, more progressive than all the countries for the West. So the question is how you see the possibility of the new revolution, and also what is the role of the avant-garde of the socialists, because we see that in this revolution in 1917 the Socialist Party don't make any role. All these leaders are on Siberia or in emigration.
Yes. Well, we need to. Well, first of all, I absolutely agree that today's United States is the one of the worst countries to live in and definitely one of the worst countries to think of any progressive change there. And your question gets even more interesting if we take into consideration that in 2020 we saw a mass movement in the United States, so the Black Lives Matter and the demonstrations in all the key American cities, the demonstrations that, like February Revolution, also came totally unexpected to analysts, to local activists, to the socialist parties that exist in the United States. And yet, why those enormous wave of protest fail and the February Revolution did succeed? I think there are two key factors that we need to take into considerations. First of all, as I said, to make a successful revolution, you need a combination of a few factors. One of them is an engagement of the broad masses, an engagement of the workers who are aware of what is their force as a class, what weapons they have as working class, and what is their crucial position in the society as a working class. So the activity of the masses would be the first factor. The second factor is how is the avant-garde party or the revolutionary party that is able to give directions, because you said, and you were absolutely correct to say, that the February Revolution took place without leaders. It is even difficult today to say who was, for example, the leader of the striking Putty Wolf workers, who led demonstrations on 24th and 5th of February. But yet we need to say that this movement with leaders was able to achieve just a limited success. For as I mentioned, there was a workers' council, the Soviet, set up during the revolutionary events, and many more local workers, soldiers, then peasants, Soviets were also appeared around all the country, but they were not able to take power just immediately. The Revolutionary Workers' Republic was not settled down. The power after the revolution went to the hands of professional politicians, to the hands of the guys who formed the provisional government, who were not pro-workers politicians, who were not socialists, who were not people really determined to break with Russian capitalism and all the social injustice it brought with it. So without leadership, just basing on the spontaneous rise of the masses, we are able to overthrow governments, but are not really sure if the new order would be really the thing that we are fighting for. For, of course, the Russian Republic that appeared after February Revolution was definitely one of the most progressive countries of the world, and definitely it made huge steps ahead. But it was not the worker states that the socialists were dreaming about, were writing about in previous decades. And the revolutionaries needed one more mobilization, more efforts to make this to set up a workers and peasant state, and not a republic that could have, if existed for more time, could have also inflated into another bourgeois republic that were already like the French Republic, for instance, to show the closest example. And here there is the third factor that we need for the revolution to succeed. There must be, I think, that to have a successful revolution, although it sounds not good, a revolution we can't have a revolution. The revolution happen and come unexpected. But for a revolution to be successful, you also need to have a division in the ruling elite. So, if the rulers are truly determined to stay in power, and if they are really ready to employ all the everything that is in their hands against the revolutionary movement, then the chances of the masses to win become really, really limited. I don't say it is impossible, but it becomes particularly difficult in today's times when the governments, the reactionary governments, hold much stronger means against the means of oppression, means of keeping their power, means of keeping their power secure than the Nicholas II had in 1917. Because we need to, we cannot forget that the bourgeois state is an oppression machine against the proletariat, against the working people, and if state rulers are determined to stay in power, they have a lot of things to be used, starting from the army to suppress the rioters, finishing with the whole series of repression measures. So, as you might have remarked during my talk on the February Revolution events, it was very important for the success of the revolution that the army did not want to disperse the crowds, that the soldiers stood on the very side of the protesters. Had the soldiers then directed their rifles against the workers, well, I don't know what could have happened next. Of course, some of the workers were armed already at that time, so they definitely there would be resistance, there would be street fighting, but wouldn't be a revolution finally against like drowned in blood, like it happened in 1905. Well, for me, it is not impossible. Had the Russian government been strong enough to stand firmly on its positions and not be devised internally. So if we are to draw conclusions from these events for our today's struggles, there are like three important things to mark. That mass movements are absolutely essential, for without the mass participations of the working class, you won't have a revolution. You won't have a revolution that would then go in the correct directions of ensuring social justice, of giving the power to the working class. If there is no activity of the aware working people, then absolutely you might think of a coup d'etat or something like this, some other regime change, but this would not be a revolution, and you have no guarantees of what happens after the regime change. The second part is the party that is able to lead the workers to react to what is happening and to listen to the workers and lead them at the same time. So the lack of organization was particularly seen during a lot of mass protests that we witnessed in 2020 and earlier. The lack of this avant-garde party was absolutely a painful view, seeing that the protests, I think about Black Lives Matter, but not only. We can also apply the same perspectives to protests in Iraq that happened in 2019, or to protests in Tunisia that re-emerged recently, or to many other revolutionary events. Like when there is no party, nobody who can give direction. People are not really sure to find that direction themselves. They might go to the street, they may scream out their anger and then go home, feeling that nobody is really listening to them, particularly given the fact when the third factor comes into place, so when the ruling class is determined to stand and not to let itself to be overthrown. And yet one more remark about the avant-garde party and the socialist parties working with working class, let's say. Yes, February Revolution took place without leaders because the leaders were not in Petrograd. But it is not that the workers that the workers came out totally spontaneously and without any knowledge of socialist ideas. You need to remember that 1905 revolution, even though it was as you said, it was destroyed. The revolutionaries were killed in hundreds, thousands even. This revolution left a mark also in ideological consciousness, for the ideas of socialism and the rule of the workers were spread among the workers for long. And if such ideas are being spread for years consequently, and by people who came from working origin, who were who were workers, like people to whom they were propagating the idea, then repressions such as the Stolypin's actions that you mentioned cannot really make the idea disappear. So yes, the workers came out to the streets in 1917 without leaders, but still with an idea in their minds, or at least a kind of a remembrance that an idea that social justice is not something totally fantastic, that there is something that I might stand for.
Okay, for my analysis, this February Revolution was betrayed. It was betrayed in three reasons. First, the reason it is the question of the lack of food. To resolve this problem, we need the other system economic, and this problem of the lack of food continue all the 1917. So it was not resolved. The second problem, it is problem of the war. That many people who demonstrating, they wanted to finish the war. And third question, it is the question of the I forgot what I want. But okay. I want you to say something about this workers' council, workers' Soviet, which was created in the Russia. Not to talk about Russia, but to give the advice mass movement which exists today. For example, we have this movement of the women in Poland, that they started to make the demonstrations to liberation the droit to the abortion. But after it was created the Council of the Strike Kobiet, who forget it about it. And in my opinion, always when we have the petty organization who try to want to be representative of the mass movement, it's finished that the people who are the most intelligent, the elite of this, they betrayed this mass movement. They forgot about all these young women who demonstrating in Poland, and they start to make the politic. They start to make a conversation with the Donald Tusk on other liberals like this. So, what can you advise for the mass movement? From this, if there's something from the 1970 when the mass movement can learn, because I think that these worker councils, that this democratization, that the workers in the meeting in the factory, or the soldiers in the meeting in the army, in the regiment, they discuss, they vote, and they decide.
Yes, indeed. And I have to tell you that I was really disappointed when this coordination council of the women's strike in Poland was set down as, I don't know, a body who was not elected by anybody. And then when it did not spread among to other, like when it did not become a structure with more local councils uniting women from different cities, and it remained just a body who, well, I don't know what it is doing now. Honestly, I don't know what it is doing, and I think that most of people in Poland really doesn't know. So, what is my advice to the mass movements? If I am entitled to give advices, well, I can rely on experiences from the past and say what worked and what did not work. So, definitely, if you want to keep people involved in a movement, they must have a feeling that they are co organizing the movement and that they are really parties not only participating on somebody's orders but they are forming the movement themselves. And here we can see the key difference between the women's council that you mentioned, the what was set up during the Polish women protest, and the workers councils of Petrograd and others revolting cities of 1917. Those workers, soldiers, peasants councils were also were organized, where people were taking decisions on what was happening around them, on what was and the like the ordinary people got the experience in government, in local government if you want, but also in the case of Petrograd Council, on the government on the very top range. So if a mass movement is to be kept a mass movement and not just a series of mobilizations, people must have the feeling that something really depends on them, and that even if there are leaders in the movement, where inevitably there must be some leaders, then these leaders hear to the people, to the voices from the people, that the people what the people invent, what the people decide after the debates is then is not just left somewhere in without any interest, but then influences what the leaders do. That the directions is the direction of the mass movement is like co-decided on the all levels of the organization. And what advice can be then given to the mass movements of today? The street demonstrations themselves do not change the system, really. Particularly in today's conditions, when the governments have really huge resources in their hands, huge resources of oppression to be used against its own citizens. It might sound strange after what I talked about the street demonstrations in Petrograd and all these hundreds of thousands of people who went to the street, but we must never forget that these demonstrations were combined with strikes in the factories, with the gatherings of the Petrograd Soviet and the Soviets in the smaller towns and cities. So people were not only telling the government to go, but also showing the government that they are able to stop the production, they are able to stop the economy, like in the case of the strikes in the factories, and that they are able to take governing in their own hands. So to which the Workers and Soldiers Council were an example. To today's activists, so I can repeat once again, walking in the streets is not enough. For today's governments have resources that are that any demonstration can be dispersed, or if it is not dispersed but then has no other clear vision to go, then the enthusiasm will wane with time, because people get tired. If people keep demonstrating for yet one day, another day, yet another week, they fight and they see that nothing happens out of that, then finally the movement does not achieve anything, even if the demonstrations can really take place in for over a long time. And here, Michał, I think that you have the more experience than me, for you have witnessed the Yellow Vests movement in France, and how the demonstrations were coming again and again, but they met the violence of the police forces and the very intransigence of Emmanuel Macron to enter in any dialogue with his own citizens. So, once again, for today's movements, let us, and somebody might say that forming up Workers and Soldiers Council is not an adequate experience for today, as we don't have in at least in Europe. We have much less big industrial centers where workers work together, and so they are inclined towards collective actions, and that we like, you know, today people are much more alienated in the neoliberal society to just to use such means. Well, it is not true that the councils are not anymore an adequate power. The very structure of capitalism, so the exploitation of working people, the very essence has not changed. And still, strike is the key weapon of the working people that we have. And and it is not impossible to organize today to seek cooperation. You see, even this Polish women's strike, which, by the way, you can have the most serious doubts on its leaders from the very beginning, not only at the moment when they began to talk with Donald Tusk, but from the very beginning. Even they felt instinctively that if you have a revolution, then your next step is to form a collective body that should take the further decisions. The fact that they did it in worst possible way as a non-elective body with a lot of people who should not be there, that is another case. But you see, even today we feel that if the wind of history is blowing, then what we need is a body that gives people the voice.
I think that our videos we can dedicate it to the Pablo Hassel, who, because it is very sad that we talk about the revolution who abolished monarchy in Russia, and in the 21st of century all the time in Europe we have monarchy, and all the time somebody who criticizes monarchy is going to the prison. So Pablo, good luck. So Malgorzata, now we can finish. I will goodbye, and other comrades who are with us. I invite you soon to other audition about Spain.
Thank you. Bye.